Good morning everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Morning Coffee with Cameron. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 5 ways you can use distortion to enhance your tracks, and today's video is brought to you by my friends over at Denise, who are makers of some of my favorite plugins and have also just recently released 2 brand new distortion plugins, Punisher and God Mode. Punisher is a really mediocre 2004 action film that I watched about 63 billion times as a kid, and it's about a guy who wants to wear cool muscle shirts and kill John Travolta's hair. It's also a really straightforward and lightweight distortion and saturation unit with 5 different selectable shapes, a very easy to use interface, and is great for adding a bit of subtle mojo and crunch or absolutely smashing things. God Mode, on the other hand, is the cheat code you look up on the internet before you boot up your favorite game because you don't know how to get good. It's also a really powerful and interesting distortion unit featuring a unique push-pull style EQ, some linear phase filters, a pretty cool side chaining feature, and a really good sound. As a quick note, I'm filming this video with an early access copy of God Mode, so things are a little bit subject to change between now and the actual release version, so bear that in mind. With all that out of the way, let's hop into the DAW and take a look at 5 different ways you can use distortions in your next track or your next mixdown session. Alright, so I've got a track here, and I wanted to play it for you first without any distortion or saturation being utilized, and then play it back again after enabling all of the distortion and saturation I've used in the mix. Then we'll be breaking down the 5 different ways you can use distortion and saturation to enhance your next track. So let's take a listen here first without any distortion or saturation. So as it stands now, we've got a pretty solid mix and a pretty solid track going, but let's take another listen after I've employed distortion and saturation in a couple different ways. As you can probably tell, things sound a bit more alive and like they kind of jump out of the speakers a bit more at you, and things seem to be lifted up and glued together in a really nice way. And I think a lot like a good EQ, a good distortion is a very important part of any mixer's toolkit. Distortion and saturation are obviously great for distorting and saturating things, but when you employ it subtly in a few different ways across a mix, it can really add up and create something that's just a bit more vibrant and sounds more like a song. So let's kick things off with the first tip about using distortion in your mix. Tip number 1 is using distortion as a drum bus glue. So let's take a listen to the drum bus before, and then we'll bring it back in here and take a listen after. It's going to be subtle, so I recommend some good headphones or monitors while we do this. And after we enable the distortion, distortion and compression are actually very closely related processes and can be used to achieve pretty similar results. One of the things you might know about is in studios that have analog equipment, a common thing is to feed a signal into a tape machine relatively hot to get a bit of that tape saturation. And this is true of saturation and distortion, is that when you apply it in certain ways with certain algorithms and wave shaping techniques, you achieve a very similar result to compression, but you also get some harmonic enhancement, and it provides that same bit of glue that compression compression does, but it also brings out a bit more color. Here on the drum bus, I've got Punisher up in mode 2 here, and Punish is at about 40%, so it's relatively aggressive, but you hear it's a subtle lift. It's not a very overly crunchy thing, because if we crank this up quite a bit, it's a little bit overdone, but if we bring it back and rein it in at about 30 to 40%, you hear that we get a bit more color and bite out of things, especially the kick and the rim shot, but it also glues things together like the percussion in a really nice way. When it comes to drums and percussive elements, another really great way to utilize distortion and saturation is to make things maybe a bit more snappy and interesting. Let's take a look at how I've used saturation here on the rim shot. Let's actually disable it on the group so we can get a better idea of what's happening. So here I've got a God mode open on the rim shot, and let's bypass this and take a listen. As a whole, things really aren't bad, and the rim shot's not really in terrible shape, but it doesn't really poke through as much as I would like it to. Here, I've used God mode, and the cool thing about this is this EQ shaping thing here with the push-pull. So what this does is it allows you to dial things in, so we can boost this range of frequencies here to feed into God mode to distort them more. You can see that I'm being pretty aggressive here with the tape, but by pulling back with the pull control and rounding off this peak, I'm still targeting that same range of frequencies where that smack and that snap is, but I'm rounding it off so it's applying a bit more of a subtle color and lift to that area. From here, we can also dial in some of the other distortion types like warp and buzz, and maybe apply filter. And really get that rim shot to jump out with a bit more color than it did before. Obviously, distortion is great on transient heavy material like drums. It can just make them snap and bite and poke out in the mix a bit more, but it's also great to apply the same principle to things like vocals or other instruments. If there's something that's just maybe lacking a bit of energy, reaching for a compressor can be great, or reaching for an EQ can be great, but by using distortion, we're applying similar techniques, but we're bringing out some extra harmonics that give it just a bit more life and also make it stand out in the mix a bit more. On a similar note, let's move on to point number 3, which is using distortion and saturation to enhance your bass in the mix, not only to improve its overall sonic character, but also get it to translate better on smaller systems. Here in my studio with my nice treated room and big giant high-powered speakers and my nice headphones, the bass in this song sounds really nice. It's really deep and very powerful. But if I brought this out to my living room to my little Bluetooth speaker or maybe to my car or tried to play it back on my phone, it's probably not going to sound like much of anything because it won't translate all that well on smaller systems. This is a really great technique I picked up from one of my own production mentors and is advice I hand out all the time to people who ask me about getting their basses to sound better and translate on different systems. This is because saturation, when applied in subtle amounts, can enhance some of the extra harmonics of a bass, even the really, really low ones, and that can make all the difference in the world for getting your tracks to sound good everywhere. Let's take a listen to this respace patch just by itself without any saturation being applied. So here I've got a plugin called Signalizer, and keep an eye on the spectrum data of this bass. As you can see, it's all pretty low and concentrated on areas that are really only going to play back on big systems. Now let's bring in God mode here, and I've boosted a little bit of the second order harmonics at about 115 Hz and also brought up a bit of a lift at about 5 to 600 Hz. Then I dialed in the tape, warp, and buzz, and then used the pull to dial things back just a touch until it started to sit right. After that, I backed off the mix just a touch, and then used the low-pass filter to filter out some of the other stuff that was happening up on the higher register that I didn't want. Now let's take a look at the bass again through Signalizer. As you can see here, we're getting a lot more harmonics and stuff going on in that second and third order harmonic area, so it's going to translate a lot better on smaller systems. A word of warning though, this is something that's very easy to overdo, because if you start to saturate too much, you're going to lose those fundamental harmonics that really give the bass that low-end power, so you've got to kind of keep an eye on it, usually with a good spectrum analyzer or just use your ears. Moving right along to tip number 4, which is utilizing distortion on a reverb or a delay send for my patented Cameron's DIRTYVERB technology. If I ever sit down and decide to get my life together and learn to code a plugin, that's going to be the first thing I'm going to make, is a reverb that feeds into a distortion, because this is a technique I picked up from Dogs on Acid or something maybe years ago, and is something I've used a lot ever since. Here I have the drum reverb, which is Perfect Room, which is another fantastic Denise plugin you really need to own, and I think this sounds fantastic on drums. So I'm sending some of the percussion and the rim shot into this, and right now it sounds like this. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but take a listen again for the subtle difference this is going to add. But if we bring in the Punisher here, I've got this on shape 1, and I'm driving this really hard. I've got the Punish at 90%, and take a listen, especially pay attention to the tail of the reverb with how it changes once we've got this on it. We can cycle through some of the different shapes here. It's a really cool trick that adds a subtle bit of blooming, warm, fuzzy character to something that might be an otherwise kind of sterile sound, and it's something I really recommend you utilize. Next time you set up a reverb send, put a little bit of saturation after it, and it can make all the difference. Finally, let's move on to point number 5, which is using distortion and saturation to add character to sounds, which I think is maybe pretty obvious, but I think is something that's often a bit overlooked. So here I've got a piano, I've got a pad up here. Let's disable the God mode on that. And then I've got another pad sound here. We'll disable the God mode on that as well. And take a listen to the way they sound right now. It's not bad, but it's maybe just, again, almost a bit sterile sounding. So it's obviously really pretty and it sounds cool, but it has almost a bit of a digital lifeless character to it. But once we bring in some distortion across it, take a listen to the change, mostly in, I guess, the emotional quality of the sound. Similar to using the saturation on the reverb, it's cool that this distortion has added a bit of bloom and mojo to these sounds, but I think it's especially interesting that by adding a little bit of saturation, we've almost given these sounds a new context in what they're trying to portray, and we almost get a sense of nostalgia and something from them. It's pretty cool stuff, and I think that is a very, very powerful thing that maybe doesn't come to mind, and I think it's something that's really worth trying. This is what I really like about God mode in particular, because if we take a listen to the first pad here without any saturation, and we'll bring it in, it's really nice to have these little frequency bands that almost act as an EQ, but it's really just boosting certain areas of the signal to be saturated. But it's awesome to be able to bring this in and hunt for those spots that really stand out. Finally, I wanted to give you guys one last little bonus tip about saturation and distortion in your mix, which is using saturation on your master bus. Now, some people might think this is kind of crazy because you don't want to distort your master, and this is very much correct, but by applying a little bit of subtle saturation to the master bus, you can really glue a track together. This is also a really great technique because when you're mastering, you obviously want to increase the volume, but you don't want to squash the dynamics out of your song entirely because that just sounds dumb. Funny enough, this is actually one of the first things I did when I got a hold of Punisher, and let's take a look at how I've used it here. If we take a look at the master chain here, we have Punisher first, followed by a master comp, a vintage warmer, and a xenon. And this is something that I'd like to point out, is that I recommend you do this very early in your mastering chain, if not as the first thing you place in your mastering chain. If you're feeding your kind of treated master signal into a saturation, it's going to be a bit overdone and it's really hard to get right. By applying it as one of the first things, if not the first thing in your mastering chain, you really only get the character applied to kind of the peaky peaks of the sound, which is really what we want. Another great thing about this is that we're enhancing the perceived volume of our track because distortion and saturation add harmonics. So by adding a bit more harmonic information, things seem louder, but they aren't actually louder. This is going to be pretty subtle, and you see I only apply about 20% of the punish here, but shape 2, there's just something about this exact sound that now finds its way onto just about every master I've done recently. So I'm going to disable it and then bring it back in and take a listen. Again, I recommend good headphones or speakers for this part because it's subtle, but it really does make a difference. And let's bring it in. As you can hear, we get a nice transparent lift to the overall level that's almost imperceptible, but everything seems a bit warmer and a bit more glued together, and that is the real magic of saturation. So I think that about wraps it up for this video. Big shout out again to my friends over at Denise for hooking me up with Punisher and God Mode. Both of these plugins are out now, and I highly recommend them, much like I do just about anything Denise makes. God Mode in particular, I think, is really interesting and sounds damn good. The side chaining feature I didn't really show off in this video because for the sake of time I didn't really have a great way to demonstrate that, but it is a very cool idea to be able to sidechain a distortion to something else, and is something I definitely need to experiment with when time allows. As always, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys again soon.